Chapter 8. The former home of Miles Dyson, California, the present. Serena dumped the dirt out of her basket and stamped it down. This was almost the last of it. She needed to excavate only another foot or two down below the house. The California night was scarcely dark to her cyber-boosted eyes. The fog of light pollution made it as bright as day. Frowning, she looked around her. It might be best to get rid of the excess dirt in raised flower beds. Otherwise, she'd end up with a suspicious-looking mound in the middle of the yard. She looked down at the filled-in swimming pool. It had only been 7 feet deep at one end, 4 feet at the other. Not deep enough. Serena was a carefully calculated 5'6", average height for a woman. But the T-101s she'd planned to construct would all be 6 feet tall. So, while she was quite comfortable standing in what would be her secret laboratory, the depth of the place must accommodate them. With a sigh, she picked up her basket. I wish I had some T-101s now to help me with this. It was heavy work. Stage 1 had been the easiest, hiring a contractor to put up a 10-foot privacy fence around the property. Necessary, since she didn't want the neighbors or any agents of trickers wondering why she was pouring dirt into the pool, or, more importantly, where it was coming from. She regretted having to drain the pool. A nice swim after work like this would have been pleasant. Gazing at the tiled area surrounding the oblong of raw dirt, she decided it looked odd. Maybe I should cover this part with concrete and make a tennis court. It will certainly improve the resale value. A slight smile quirked at her lips. This could be dangerous. I'm starting to think like a human. Actually, she had little real fear of that happening. It was like running a subroutine, easily terminable. But such thoughts improved her ability to pass. She'd always been good at that. She remembered. Skynet Labs, Holding Cells, 2025. Serena stepped delicately, like a frightened deer, into the cell. There was a boy here of approximately 13, her own apparent age. This would be the first time she'd met a wild human face to face. She supposed the caretakers and slaves were the same breed, but service to Skynet had tamed them, made them safe. This boy might do anything. Her assignment was to seduce him. Serena licked her lips with a combination of anticipation and slight nervousness. This could be quite a challenge. The cell appeared to be deserted. Serena leaned forward, studying the empty walls. Actually, she could hear him. He was just above her head, clinging to a beam inside the doorway. So, he was clever, a survivor, good genetic stock. Well, what are you going to do? Serena wondered, already bored with her shy act. It seemed she would have to provoke a response. Hello? She said, putting a quaver into her voice. She took a breath and straightened up. Then she took a step backward, reaching behind her for the door latch. She heard cloth slide across metal above her head. Well, finally. He dropped onto her shoulders and bore her to the ground, his hand crushing her mouth. Serena struggled, making muffled squealing noises as she writhed against him. This was unpleasant, The damned humans smelled. He was strong, she noted, but light. The I-950 could have tossed him around the room with one hand. "Stop it!" he hissed into her ear. "I'm going to take my hand away. Don't scream, or I'll break your neck." With a shudder that was actually suppressed laughter, Serena nodded. He slowly took his hand away. Part of the offensive smell was his fear, completely justified since his lifespan could be measured in days. This boy wouldn't know anything of use to Skynet. His only utility was as a training tool for its children. She was the first to approach him. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'll ask the questions," he said roughly. He still lay on top of her, and unless she missed her guess, he was enjoying it. She turned slightly so that they were lying front to front. Oh yes, he was enjoying this. "Please, don't hurt me," she pleaded, allowing tears into her eyes. He seemed to grow. He certainly swelled as he looked down on her. "Who are you?" he demanded gruffly. "What are you doing here?" It was impressive that he could stay focused on the situation at hand, despite his condition and his circumstances. I was curious," she stammered, in apparent fear. I've never met anyone from outside." She paused, looking into his face, searching it. "What's it like to be free?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" I've never been outside," she said, trembling. The trembling felt fake to her, so she added a little gasp. "Never?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I was born here," she whispered. Serena choked back a sob. "This is a terrible place. They perform experiments on us." Which was perfectly true. Her whole life was an experiment. His face changed, his eyes softened, and he caressed her cheek with one rough hand. "I'm sorry," he said. She burst into tears, and he moved so that he was cradling her, rocking her and making soothing noises. It was very pleasant. Serena was convinced that if she had really been weeping, this would have calmed her. She reached up and caressed his face, looking into his eyes. He lowered his head towards her, tentatively, then stopped. Serena put her hand behind his neck and pulled him the rest of the way down. Their kiss was sweet at first, a kiss between two children. Then slowly it deepened, grew warmer, more passionate. His hand stroked her back, the rhythm becoming swifter, more demanding, like the kiss. She made the first move, slipping out of the flimsy tunic that was all she wore. He stared at her physical perfection for a moment, as though stunned. Then she leaned forward and began to help him undress, exclaiming wordlessly over small scars on his body, kissing them when she found them. She lost her nominal virginity to that boy, then broke his neck at Skynet's orders. A very pleasant interlude altogether. Former Dyson home, the present. Serena smiled reminiscently. Yes, she'd always been good at getting humans to trust her. Picking up the 2 baskets, she headed back to her digging. She had cut through the concrete floor of a guest room to begin removing the dirt beneath. Today she would finish the digging and pour the cement into the holes for the support poles. As soon as that was dry, she would put in a moisture barrier, a cement floor and concrete blocks, and steel posts to support the walls. Next would be the installation of a sophisticated climate control and air purification system. The parts were already waiting in the guest room. Then she could bring in the rest of the equipment and begin using her lab. In the meantime, she'd been jobbing out the parts needed to construct the skeletons of her T-101s, using over a dozen different specialty foundries throughout the United States. Their product came to several different post office boxes, none of them closer than 2 towns away. So far, their work had been excellent. When time allowed, she'd check into using foreign manufacturers for maximum privacy. She imagined that many precision metal workers knew each other. It wouldn't do if several accidentally discovered that they were manufacturing different parts that looked suspiciously right beside each other and started to put them together. But her real concern was that the Connors would learn of her work. Serena thought about Skynet's enemies as she filled another basket with dirt. The Connors had, very effectively, disappeared after destroying Cyberdyne's old facility. Sightings of them had been reported for a few months afterward, but none had panned out. To all intents and purposes, the pair had ceased to exist. Wouldn't that be nice? Serena thought, jabbing the shovel into the hard-packed earth. Nice, but unlikely. She'd posted a lookout for their names on the internet. Should anyone start discussing them or look for information on them, she would be alerted. She had also tagged their files at the FBI and CIA. Anyone looking for information there was more likely to lead her to her quarry. Hoisting the filled baskets onto her shoulders, she tried to close her mind to the knowledge that Skynet's minions had come out the losers every time they tangled with the Connors. Serena climbed the ladder out of her lab-to-be and forced herself to think of the next step in the process. If she pushed, she could be ready to start the delicate work of creating T-101s by late next week. She'd acquired artificial teeth and some precision tools from a series of dental supply companies and a matrix material used to grow new flesh for skin grafts from a surgical supply store. It was amazing what you could do and what you could acquire if you had a healthy amount of cash. She would use her own blood as a starter. The chemicals necessary to promote cell growth were resting in her refrigerator. Except for the brute effort required to prepare her small laboratory, everything was set to go, or on its way. She should have the first Terminator ready to mingle with humans in under 2 months. Unless Cyberdyne called on her to begin work, she should be able to work undisturbed on her new accomplice. Once she'd made one T-101, it could easily construct others. But she was also eager to begin protecting Skynet. I know they're going to hire me. They know they're going to hire me. What then is the hold-up? Tricker? Probably. But the government liaison didn't seem to be anywhere around just now. He was probably doing some last-minute foot-dragging just to assert his authority, or perhaps a bit more investigation. Although she was pretty sure her background sources would check out. Tricker was a deep one. I can trust my own groundwork, she assured herself. If worse came to worst, she could always simply eliminate Tricker. She would regret it. He was the most interesting person she'd met here. But she could live with regret. What she couldn't live with was failure. Ohio, on the road to Earth Fair, present day. People keep imagining, Ron LeBain said to the two filmmakers, that someday everyone in the world will enjoy the lifestyle North Americans take for granted. He looked off into the distance. I can't remember who said it, but it's been estimated that it would take 8 more planets to achieve that goal. That seems excessive, Peter Zeidman said. Our lifestyle is excessive, Ron countered. We could all live much more simply and probably be happier for it. Only an economy like this one could support our constant fads, constant upgrading of cars and stereos and computers. We don't even wear things out anymore. There's no time for that. They're outmoded as soon as you buy them, so we bury them. Ron shook his head gently. It can't go on indefinitely. Common sense says it can't go on forever. So what do we do? Zeidman asked. He was pleased. He'd expected a wild man from what the co-chair had said, but he'd gotten a well-spoken, well-informed man with a message. This could work out. With the right handling, and maybe a little cash infusion from his father. Well, that's going to involve some hard choices, LeBain answered. Industry isn't just going to start gearing down voluntarily. They'll use the same excuse they've used for over 100 years. He waved his hands and raised his eyes to heaven. We have to answer to our stockholders. We must show a profit. It's our duty. Ha! Their duty is to get as fat as they can before they dole out the crumbs to their sacred stockholders. So, laws? Zeidman said. LeBain shook his head. I'm no lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that the Constitution has a few things to say about restraint of trade. Unfortunately, that doesn't take into consideration the world around us. Actually, the change has to come from us. Buy less. Streamline your life. Learn to live by that old Yankee saying. Buy it new, wear it out, make it do without. The alternative is to imagine your great-great-grandchildren wading through discarded motherboards and acid rain up to their ankles. Zeidman glanced at Tony, who adjusted the camera and nodded. This is great stuff, he said to LeBain. Where did you get this? I wrote a book, Ron said. I got to rework it though. There's far too much material to get it published as is. I must have read hundreds of books on the subject. He nodded. Hundreds at least. None of my work is really original. It's a synthesis. He slapped his knees. But you need those. Every now and again, someone has to get it all together and present the salient points. And that's what I want to do, so that people can decide just what it is they ought to do to save the world. Cut, Zeidman said. I'd like to get some shots of you doing things like walking along a river or the seashore or through a meadow someplace, if that's all right with you. We could do a voiceover of you, maybe reading from your book. How would that be? I hate to sound mercenary, LeBain said. But am I getting paid to be in this opus of yours? Because I'm living in my van right now. Peter held up a hand. Okay, he said. Here's the deal. We're doing this on a shoestring ourselves. So until and unless the film is sold for distribution, all we can offer is room and board. And parking. Zeidman screwed up his face. Okay. He held out his hand. "You drive a hard bargain." "You ain't seen nothing yet," Ron said. He went along with the two young men to their hotel room, free shower at last, so that they could discuss the film and terms. They talked like kids from Money. They had that insouciant near arrogance of youngsters who'd never had to go without. The hotel was one of those where everything that wasn't cream-coloured was pastel, and where the room service came with chased silver napkin rings. It was pretty certain that these two wouldn't go out of their way to save the world. So what? Ron thought. There's nothing wrong with a mutually agreeable arrangement. If he got lucky, it could be like being the lead singer in a rock group. If this movie hit, he'd be the one the public remembered, not the two kids singing backup. Ron smiled. Oh yes, he'd milk these kids for all they were worth, and if he did it the right way, by the time he was finished, they'd still believe he was a starry-eyed idealist. The thing was to get the message out to those with the ears to hear it. A simple message, really. Stop the madness of overproduction, whatever it takes. Mentally, he sneered at the spoiled boys beside him. He was certain they saw themselves as rebels because they wanted to make documentaries instead of getting real jobs in their daddy's companies. Wilmington, Delaware, the present. Jordan Dyson chewed on his lower lip. The advertisement for a head of security for Cyberdyne was no longer listed. He'd seriously considered applying for the job. He knew that some agents had gone on to lucrative civilian careers in security or related fields. But he liked working for the Bureau. Besides, he probably didn't have the street cred. His job here was primarily research, and he was very, very good at it. But they would probably be looking either for someone who had climbed the corporate ladder, or someone who'd been outrunning bullets and clipping on handcuffs. Jordan tapped his fingers against his chin. Of course, he could join the firm in a lesser position. Being in the FBI would definitely be an entree to Cyberdyne then. The difficulty would be in getting the time. He really did not want to quit. The difficulty would also lie in surviving up to a 6-month break in his career. But I have to get inside there. It was the only way he could know the workings of the place, get to know the people, maybe get into the files that most people didn't get to see. But most important, he needed to be present at Cyberdyne because he was certain, as certain as anyone relying on pure gut instinct could be, that within 3 months the Connors would find out about Miles's project starting up again. And then they'd come knocking on Cyberdyne's doors, probably with high explosives. Jordan sighed. I wonder if I can work out some kind of part-time arrangement. Los Angeles, the present. Danny pushed his home fries around his plate while he stared into space, apparently unaware that his mother had stopped eating to watch him, as if she knew he had something to say that he didn't think she'd want to hear. Teresa pursed her lips, then smiled. You have something on your mind, son? I've been thinking, he said, with an alacrity that made her blink. It was rare that he was so forthcoming these days. I think we ought to tell him. Teresa felt like she'd been punched in the gut. She looked down, fiddled with her napkin for a moment, then folded and dropped it onto her plate. She looked at her son's determined face. "Don't think I haven't thought about it, Dan," she said quietly. "I have, a lot. Especially right after it happened." It suddenly occurred to her that she'd known instantly who and what Dan meant. She tipped her head, considering him. "But I couldn't think how to make him believe me, honey. Look what happened to Sarah Connor all that time in Pescadero." Teresa shook her head sadly. Didn't matter that she was telling the truth. Nobody believed her. Teresa sat back and let out her breath in a long sigh. She looked across the table at Danny and knew she might as well be looking across the country. She wasn't reaching him. "I don't want to go to that place," she said between her teeth. "I freely admit it scares me to death. I saw what it did to that woman." Teresa put her hand to her forehead. "If I had told your uncle what happened just after your father died, I'm absolutely certain that I'd have ended up in a straitjacket." Dan nodded. "And I was just a little kid," he said. "No way I could back up your story." He leaned forward, his hands reaching out. "But I'm older now. I'm sure he'd believe me now." Teresa tilted her head, a pained expression on her face. "Mom, we have to tell him," Dan said in measured tones. "This is destroying his life, and if he ever does find the Connors, he'll destroy them. Come on, Mom, we've got to tell him." God, she thought fondly, he's so dramatic. But maybe he's right. Maybe it is time. She sighed. "All right, but I want him here with us when we tell him. I want him to be able to look us in the eye." It might just be the one thing that destroyed their relationship, but Danny was right. This was torturing her brother-in-law, and they couldn't just stand back, knowing the truth, and not try to help. Maybe knowing everything would help. Dan nodded solemnly. "Good," he said. "But don't leave it too long. I've got a feeling he might do something drastic, like quit the FBI."